Hi, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7. In this chapter, we're going to be focusing on a particular subfield of psychology called behaviorism. To put that more in everyday language, we will be talking about learning. Other than the chapters towards the end of this semester where we get into my area of expertise, meaning talking about clinical psychology, this really is one of my favorite chapters. I just think that this chapter, more so than any other area of psychology we're going to talk about, has so many applications to everyday life. And I hope as I start to go through this and as you did your Rebel reading, you should be seeing examples of this everywhere. And so I just think that this chapter is so neat because it so simplistically explains many of the things that we do. So to talk about behaviorism and learning, I'm going to start by talking about classical conditioning in this video. The next video, I'm going to shift to talking about operant conditioning, and then I'll also kind of wrap up the chapter by talking about some other principles related to learning and behaviorism. So when I say behaviorism, I'm talking about a particular school of thought. It's a subfield of study in psychology that accounts for behaviors in terms of observable acts and events. A couple decades ago, there was kind of this shift in the field where the clinicians and the people providing therapy started to really focus in on things that weren't observable. We were talking about the unconscious. This was prime time for Freud to start talking about all these like unobservable urges and kind of sinful beliefs that people aren't even really in tune with. And we'll talk more about Freud later in the semester. But essentially all you need to know at this point is there was this shift in the field where people were starting to debate whether we should be trying to study these things that aren't observable, or should we be looking at these kind of more observable acts and events that are right in front of us. And so behaviorism grew out of this kind of belief or this idea that we really can account for and understand behaviors by just sticking to what is directly, tangibly observable right in front of us. And so the kind of more extreme behaviorists actually believe that all behaviors, everything we do as humans, or all things that all animals do, to make it even broader, are a result of learning or conditioning. So I've kind of put all with a question mark here in parentheses, just to kind of say that, some people actually think everything about human behavior and animal behavior is a result of learning. Your textbook kind of scales back a little bit and just says many behaviors. And so I think everybody in the field of psychology would say most behaviors, a lot of the behaviors that we engage in, are absolutely a result of learning and conditioning. It just depends how far you want to take that. So for example, one of our professors in the psychology department, Dr. Stallman, is a very extreme behaviorist. He actually thinks there's no such thing as free will. So based on his research and his expertise, he does not believe people make conscious decisions. He thinks everything is simply a result of learning or kind of behavioral theory. And so that's maybe a little bit extreme when you look at most researchers, but there is some evidence to support his claims, and he will fight you to the death, trying to defend his stance. And so what we're talking about in this entire lecture is learning, which basically just reflects relatively permanent change in behavior due to experience. And so you can think of the kind of classic example of once you ride a bike, you know how to ride a bike, right? And so that's what we're talking about when I say learning. So it's by experiencing something and kind of walking through the process of something, you now have acquired that information. And so there's really two main types of learning, classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and that's what we're going to focus on. All right, so let's start with classical conditioning. So the name associated with this particular type of conditioning is Ivan Pavlov. Even if you've never taken a general psychology class, it's possible that you've heard his name. Really, classical conditioning, Pavlov, Pavlov's dogs, those are all phrases we actually hear a lot in pop culture, and I'll show you a video clip reflecting that here in a few minutes. What's really kind of neat about this is Pavlov didn't start out researching learning. That actually wasn't his area of expertise. He was conducting a study on salivation in dogs. That doesn't sound like the most exciting research to me, but he thought it was really cool. And so he had a bunch of dogs in the lab, and they had hooked them up to these machines so they could measure salivation output. And to get the dog to salivate for the purposes of the study, they would put food in front of them. But the research assistant started to notice that the dog would begin to salivate before the food was present. Even just the researcher walking into the room would trigger the dog to salivate. And so they kind of paused and said, well, isn't that interesting? Does that make sense? Why would the dog be salivating just at the sight of the researcher? And so they actually kind of scrapped their other idea and their other research and started focusing on what we now call classical conditioning. So classical conditioning talks about how through learned experiences, the dog is going to associate other things with the food. So they might associate seeing the research assistant with food. They might associate the researcher opening a particular cabinet with the food. And so it's that like learning association. That's why it's classical conditioning is sometimes called associative learning, is that the dog learns to associate other cues or other triggers with food, which will then prompt that response. So to understand classical conditioning, the first thing you need to know is what an unconditioned stimulus is. So an unconditioned stimulus is a stimulus that does not need to be conditioned. It's going to naturally elicit a response. And so for animals, food is an unconditioned stimulus. If you have a pet, you know that the minute you put food into their bowl, they are going to just get so excited, run around. They might knock you out of the way. They're going to, immediately start eating. I've never really seen an animal who just, doesn't really care once there's food put in their bowl. And so the unconditioned stimulus in this situation is the food. The unconditioned response could be salivating, like you can see this cute dog, his tongue's drooping out. Some dogs start to pant. And that's just that kind of natural, unsolicited, just naturally occurring response. Okay, so it's really important that you understand an unconditioned stimulus is something that does not need to be conditioned and just kind of naturally leads to a response, which we call the unconditioned response. And so in classical conditioning, what we want to see happen, or what the kind of desired outcome is we want the dog or whatever animal to start to associate this stimulus with what is it called a neutral stimulus. So at the beginning, like in this example, I think it's going to be a bell ringing. In Pavlov's example, it was just the researcher walking in the room. So a neutral stimulus is something that at the beginning of the process does not elicit a response. So if you have an animal and you have a bell, go ring that bell at your animal and see what happens. Chances are nothing. Like I know if I walked up to my cat right now and was ringing a little bell, she would just look at me like, I don't know what you want, right? So that's a neutral stimulus. But what starts to happen through this conditioning process is we are preceding the unconditioned stimulus with this neutral stimulus. So with a dog, you could ring the bell and then present the food. Ring the bell, present the food. So that stimulus that you're trying to pair with the unconditioned stimulus must always precede it. It must signal. Okay, so essentially the neutral stimulus must reliably signal the unconditioned stimulus. So in this situation, through enough experience or enough repetitions of this neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned or learned stimulus. And so the bell eventually, with enough pairings or opportunities, this bell will go from being a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, which means it will lead to the conditioned response. Okay, so I know there's a lot of words and this can be a little bit confusing the first time you hear it, but that's why I'm trying to go through it a few different times, a few different ways. So let's put this all together. So we have this cute dog. I picture his name being Bruno. I don't know why, but let's kind of do this with Bruno. So before conditioning, you ring a bell at Bruno. He looks at you like you are just not doing what he wants you to do, right? He's like, okay, great. That was pretty nice bell. So that's a neutral stimulus. There's no response. But then through enough pairings, if every time you ring that bell, you give Bruno a bowl of food and you do that a few times, bell, food, then eventually that bell is going to become a conditioned stimulus that leads to a conditioned response. Okay, so during the pairing, what's happening here is this is a conditioned stimulus, this is an unconditioned stimulus, and it's until conditioned, we consider it an unconditioned response. Okay, so let me kind of back up and do this again because I know this is new for most of you. So what ends up happening is you ring your neutral stimulus bell. So this is a stimulus that does not lead to a response. But now we want to try to condition Bruno to salivate when he sees the conditioned stimulus. So you ring the bell, give him food, he salivates. You ring the bell, you give him food, he salivates. And eventually, that salivation is going to become a conditioned response, meaning he's salivating because of the bell, not because the food, right? Because you ring the bell, there is no food yet, and look, he's salivating, okay? So again, I think this is easiest to think about in terms of if you have a pet or you've seen an animal, up close. Hopefully you have experience with pets. And so what we know is that animals are constantly being conditioned. Okay, and I have seen this firsthand with my cat. There's a little Tupperware container that has her treats in it, and it has these snaps on it. The minute she hears those snaps, she knows she's getting a treat. So she associates the snap with the food. And so she can be anywhere in the house and she knows what that little snapping sound sounds like, and she comes running. So just a few other principles. The first one is extinction. So if you are repeatedly presenting the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, then eventually that learning response is going to disappear. So if you ring the bell a bunch of times at Bruno and you don't give him food, he's going to stop salivating, okay? Higher order conditioning is where you then pair another neutral stimulus on top of it. So let's say if right before you ring the bell, you flash a light. So you're pairing another neutral stimulus, which is a light, to an already established conditioned stimulus, which is the bell. And so eventually Bruno is going to associate the flash with the food, right? And so it's a higher order, you're pairing an additional stimulus. Stimulus generalization is where something that is similar is going to produce the same reaction. So for example, my cat has been conditioned anytime she hears a can opener, she assumes that she's getting tuna, even if I'm opening a can of beans. And so she was never conditioned to respond to beans. She doesn't like beans. Trust me, I've tried. But she has generalized her learned reaction or learned behavior from tuna to the same stimulus with the can of beans being opened, because it sounds very similar. Stimulus discrimination. My friend has a very smart dog that she has trained to be very well behaved, and the trigger word for that dog to be allowed to do something is release. And so when that dog sits, and then my friend wants her to, eat or is allowed to play with a toy or whatever, she says release. And so she had to actually condition that dog to discriminate the word release from other words. And I've actually seen this in action. That dog can discriminate release from lease, which is remarkable. Because of generalization, most animals would then react the same. This dog doesn't. So it's actually really amazing. As I mentioned, there are a lot of references to classical conditioning and Pavlov and his dogs, even just in pop culture. And so I know from the discussion board, most of you like The Office, which is awesome because that's my favorite TV show. And so there's actually an example from The Office where one of the characters tries to classically condition his coworker. So we'll go ahead and watch this clip. The volume's a little bit weird, so I'm going to have to turn it up. You might have to turn it up, but hopefully you can hear it.
Damn, lost another file. Gonna have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an Altoid? What do you think? In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, want an Altoid? Okay. Altoid? Sure. Pink. Pink? Yes. What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden.
So again, just a perfect example of classical conditioning where Dwight begins to associate the sound of his computer with needing an Altoid.